Okay, hello. This is a pretty interesting webinar, and it's about a topic that I think a lot of people, especially when they're young, believe is very important for their career, and it's something that a lot of young people, especially, believe matters, and is something that is really stay with you throughout your whole career, your law school grades. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I will take some questions. I don't have a ton of time for questions today, but after this webinar, I'll take questions about what we're talking about today in law school grades, and then go from there. But the most important things to understand about grades are they're very important for a lot of law firms when they're making hiring decisions. But really, the weight that they carry is much more important when you're a junior attorney or law student than if you're a mid-level associate or partner. I'm going to explain why today. And they're important, but at each stage of your career, the importance of these grades really diminishes quite a bit. And then your work experience really starts taking the most precedence in your hiring decisions, so much so that once you're out a few years, grades typically don't matter much. And there are some firms that will not look at you unless you have the best grades, and not a ton of them, but there are firms. And the very best firms, which would be Latham, Skadden, Wachtell, and places like that, will almost never hire you or even interview you unless you have incredible academic performance, regardless of the stage in your career. But for the most part, the most prestigious firms are really willing to look at individuals who are the best performers, even from schools that aren't in the top 10 or even the top 25. And really what those firms are looking for is they're looking for people that are very good. And in their minds, that really does start the second you receive your grades in law school, whether it's your first, second, whether it's a first, second, or third year law school. And the idea is either you have it, meaning you have the kind of qualifications that they need, or you don't. And so they're concerned about that. And there's a lot of reasons that the best law firms care a lot about grades. The main reason is that it's from a competitive standpoint, it's so they can show their clients that they have the very best people possible doing the work. And then other attorneys will also often talk about these firms and how difficult they're to get into. And then these firms can often be as selective as they are because they have a lot of applications. A lot of people want to work there. They typically pay the highest salaries. And if you want to move to the very highest rungs of legal practice, which is defined for prestige, then your grades may be important throughout your career. So the first thing is grades for junior attorneys and law students. And this is where the grades typically will matter the very most. If you've ever and can participate in on-campus recruiting in law school, the grades are extremely important, and that law firms are always using them to hire junior attorneys. And by the way, the most important really for law students, they're more important for law students than junior attorneys. So the reason is and there's really no other point in your career will be more important than where you when you're looking for work as a law student. The reason is they have no other way to compare what type of potential you have as an attorney other than your grades and the quality of law school you went to. And it's so very important for law students to have good grades in order to get the best positions. There's just very little that law firms have to go on other than the quality of law school you're at or your grades, and they're making hiring decisions. They can look at your college and your performance there, and they can see activities and things like that. And they can also look at how much they like you. But in terms of judging your potential as an attorney compared to other people in your law school, and really the most important thing they have is grades. And it's really the most important standard that they use other than the quality of law school you go to. And you have to understand there's a lot of studies, for example, that have been done. And in terms of your LSAT score, for example, that's typically the most important criteria of your academic group, what's more likely to, where you're likely to, it shows how likely you are to do academically in law school is your LSAT score, not your grades. And it often also shows how well you're likely to do your first year of law school, which is very interesting with the LSAT. And there's been a lot of studies also that have shown that your performance in your first year of law school and not during your second and third years is the best predictor of whether or not you'll pass your state's bar exam in your first attempt. The people that do the best in their first year of law school typically are the ones that also are most likely to pass the bar. And the largest and most prestigious firms are typically the ones that have the most stringent grade cutoffs for law students. And the firms that do on-campus recruiting in your law school also place a great deal of emphasis on grades. because it's the only way they can compare all the people that are trying to work there at one time is based on their grades. A lot of the biggest and best national firms will only consider graduates in the top 5% of their class. And yet they'll consider from other schools, they'll want you to be in the top 50% of your class. And it could be, if you go to your Harvards and your Michigans and some really good law schools, they may want you to be in the top 50% of your class. But if you go to a local law school, like New York Law School or something, the law firms may require you, and that are interviewing at New York Law School would only interview the people in the top 5% of their class, depending on the law school. As you go down the law school ranking, it becomes more and more important for you to have the best grades possible. And if you attended school like Yale Law School, your grades are going to be far less important to most law firms than if you attended a fourth-year law school, because they're just going to be very impressed with Yale, as opposed to another type of law school. So it's important to note that law students from most law schools, you could always find a position regardless of your grades. But if you're interviewing with firms that don't do a lot of on-campus recruiting, then those firms are probably going to not emphasize grades as much as they otherwise would. And a lot of smaller firms also may emphasize grades a lot compared to top national law firms, because they may be more than happy to get a grade student from your school. And finally, there's a lot of specialties like patent law where they're usually looking for technical type people, where so your grades may be emphasized even less than your undergraduate performance by some firms. And those recruiters were always amazed that grades are not always emphasized as much as some attorneys might think. I've seen attorneys at the bottom of their classes at fourth-year law schools get positions with top national firms. But in general, there's a lot of predictability as to what kind of law firm a student will end up based on their grades. And there's exception to these rules, but you can see, and I continue to see them on an ongoing basis, but the fact that there are exceptions, and if you don't get good grades, even in not the best law schools, there are forces that are beyond work and the hiring decisions of a lot of law firms. And one other thing I just wanted to bring to your attention when people ask about the importance of grades, what does it really happen? There's a couple things that's interesting. So you have your firms that do a lot of work for corporations and big corporations, and that bill a lot of money working for companies. So that would be commercial litigation or commercial real estate, corporate, and so you have different types of law firms. And then you have law firms that work for individuals, which would be like doing family law or trust in estates or insurance defense is a form of working for individuals. And anytime you're working for a corporation, the corporations often have general counsels, and they're very more concerned about your grades, and pay higher salaries because companies can afford to pay a lot of money, as opposed to individuals, where the individuals, firms that work for individuals, personal injury, that sort of thing, they're not going to have to be as selective. They're not going to pay as much money. And therefore, they're typically not going to be as demanding about grades. So your grades are important. One of the things to understand of where your grades are important depending on the type of firm you want to work for. So if you want to work for a big firm that represents companies, or a firm that represents companies, then grades are going to be more important than if you want to work for a firm that represents individuals. So that's just something to think about. Things like criminal defense, family law, insurance defense, trust in the states, personal injury, firms where they represent individuals are much more easier to, your grades matter far less than firms that represent companies. So then you have junior associates. So after you get out of law school, and you may have 1 to 3 years of experience, law firms that are considered, if you're considering a lateral move, these law firms are typically worried about their junior associates are often worried about their academic performance and what it might affect it have on their ability to move. And the reason associates worry about this so much is because they've been so recently conditioned about the importance of grades during law school. So when you're in law school, all you hear about is how important grades are. But when you get out and you're junior associates, it begins to, and you start moving as a junior associate, it becomes less and less important. And what happens is when you're in law school, it may be very hard to get in some of these top national firms, for example, and you may believe that you're always going to have a hard time moving. And it's really not the case. Once you become a junior associate, it becomes much more easy to move if you're in a certain practice area and you want to move. And the grades become far less important. And the reason for this is really the law of supply and demand. The law of supply and demand is important throughout your legal career, but as a law student, you're competing with people that were just the only way to distinguish you was based on the quality of law school you were going to and your law school grades. And the best jobs when you're young and you're just in law school are going to the best law students from the best law schools. But when you become a practicing attorney, moving laterally, the best jobs and typically are going to go to the attorneys who are most in demand. In this case, more often than not, this means that the attorneys from the best firms with a certain level of experience and demonstrated expertise the firms need are more likely to be able to move than others. I'll talk a little bit about the law of supply and demand, but as a lateral attorney, you're really going to be competing with fewer attorneys for the same positions, and firms are not going to be able to be as selective in terms of your grades. One of the things that's important to understand is when you start moving as a junior associate, hopefully you've begun to specialize in some branch of law. And the more arcane that branch of law is, meaning the fewer people do it, like would be ERISA or some sort of real estate finance, I'm just giving you some examples, the fewer attorneys you're going to be competing with for the same position if there's openings in the market. So when you're a law student, everyone's competing for the same positions in law firms to get a position as a summer associate or an entry-level attorney. But once you get out of law school and you develop a specialty, the only people you're competing with are other people that have that specialty in your geographic area, and it becomes much less important. So what happens is when an attorney gets out, they're typically not that productive, meaning you're learning on the job. And a lot of times firms will have to write off a lot of your time. But as you get more skills and experience, your value increases because you don't need a lot of training. You're much more, you know what you're doing and do not have to write off as much of your time. And the value of this training increases exponentially depending on how few attorneys practice in the same branch of law as you do. So many attorneys also leave the practice of law during the first 3 years. So you'll have a specialty, for example, and the more you learn about your specialty and the more you stick with that specialty, the fewer people you're going to be competing with, because only people that you have to compete with for the same jobs are people with that specialty. And then a lot of attorneys also leave the practice of law during the first 3 years. If you continue to practice and you're competing with fewer people, if you continue to practice, you're competing with fewer people because people are dropping out of the race. And so as people drop out of the race, there's fewer people to compete with. And because there are fewer people to compete with, what happens is the firms don't feel the need to be as selective with which attorneys they're willing to hire because there are fewer attorneys in the market. So they're no longer using your grades necessarily as a criteria to exclude you. They're using your experience. And then if you've dedicated to a certain geographical area, you've started working in a certain area of the country, that's also going to help you because you're going to have stability in a certain region, and the law firms are going to believe that you're likely to stick around there too. And then also the law of supply and demand also happens. A lot of attorneys accept jobs with firms that are not conducive to moving to a grade conscious firm at a later date. And so that also can affect things as well. For example, a lot of attorneys will work in insurance defense firms or small unknown firms that do unsophisticated work. And there's nothing wrong with this, but the fact that most firms care about grades and want to hire attorneys they perceive having the ability to practice in a certain type of environment. And because the substantial majority of graduates go to firms that grade conscious firms perceive as not necessarily having a high level of training, the fact of the matter is that most grade conscious firms cannot afford to be overly grade conscious when they're hiring laterals. And the fact that what most firms are looking at when you're a junior associate is the firm you're coming from. It's far more important than your grades. If a firm needs someone that's a corporate transactional attorney and you're doing corporate transactional work, they're more concerned about that than they would be, for example, your grades when you're in law school. It's much more important. And what's interesting when you see certain practice areas get very busy. So in 1998 to 2000, corporate was very busy. It was also very busy maybe 2011, and it got very busy in 2020. And there's different times when there's 2013. But anyway, there's different times when it's gotten very busy. And a lot of the most prestigious national firms during these times when it's got busy were hiring people out of small firms, often without even seeing a transcript. And then what happens when those kind of things happen is if you're in a very in-demand specialty, law firms are having more work than they can handle. And so they're really just concerned about hiring people that can do the work. And a lot of times the best names in the legal profession were completely inflexible with lowering their standards at that time. But a lot of firms weren't and really hired anyone they could possibly get their hands on. And the importance of grades often completely vanished. Notice to say that grades were irrelevant, but with the law of supply and demand, you can see that grades are just far more important later in your career. If there's a lot of demand in your practice area, then law firms are much more likely to not care. And then when it reverses itself, which it always does, then there's a lot of people fighting for the same positions, and grades again become much less important. And then the next one is mid-level to senior associates. And so in this realm, the same prejudices that the largest firms have about grades are still present, and they often are. A law firm may be somewhat interested in your grades, but as recruiters, I've noticed that firms really will often look the other way and not take grades as seriously as they would for law students when they're dealing with someone with substantial experience. And it's just oftentimes they don't even ask for transcripts, even with some junior associates that are in a certain specialty. They're just more concerned about where they're coming from and their experience doing that. And mid-level associates, law firms start being more concerned about your specialty and your legal skills and the potential you show than really anything else. And if you're coming from a good law firm, then they'll pretty much assume you have the training to do the work that they need done. Mid-level associates are really the most marketable types of attorneys because they can do the work efficiently. That law firms don't need to write off a lot of time. And mid-level associates can also really do work without a lot of supervision. And most firms that are hiring mid-level associates may look at your grades, but their biggest concern is really going to be the potential to show for growth and being able to do the work. And it's your specialization, the number of attorneys still practicing in that specialty, where you are geographically working, and then the firms, the most important thing is the firm you're coming from and the type of work that you've done. That's really it. And mid-level associates are really the most marketable out there. The law firms care much more about their practice area than they do anything else. And then you have a senior associate. So these factors are also very important in a law firm's evaluation of your strengths. But the firms become more concerned with your potential to make partner, your business generation abilities, and then these factors in your really are more important than grades with 99% of law firms. And then partners, grades have almost no importance for partners. They're concerned about your business generation abilities, but other factors are really, grades are almost irrelevant. I would say it's probably even more than 7 out of 10 partner places, maybe even 9 out of 10 firms ever often just don't even request grades. There are exceptions, but a lot of prestigious national firms will consider your grades very important throughout your career. But I've seen partners who were some of the very best firms that not get interviews because of their law school grades. But this occurs very infrequently. There's not many firms that are not going to accept someone with a lot of business because of their grades. There's a few out there like Gibson Dunn and a few really regarded firms, but most firms really do not care very much about your grades when you get more senior. So again, just to reiterate, the grades are far more important for law students. Law school grades are really the only measure of what you've done related to the legal field before you enter a firm. So there's really no other way for a firm to judge your abilities at this level. And then once you've reached a point in your career where you've gained a lot of work experience, the grades become far less important. And the legal career, is 30 to 50 plus years for many people. I've now seen people practicing in the mid-80s. Your law school performance is really the most important, not the most important criteria by any stretch of the imagination of what kind of success you'll have practicing law. And there are some firms where your grades will prevent you from getting a position throughout your career, but really even when you're out of law school, once you get a specialty and are doing something, the law firms really care very little about your grades. Okay, so I'm going to take just a quick break, and then when I come back, I'll answer a few questions. This is a short summer webinar, and unfortunately, I don't have a ton of time today, but the following next week, I'll do a much more in-depth webinar. But the big thing to understand about grades really is that they're just a screening mechanism that's most important for you to get a position really when you're in law school, and then when you're out of law school, your specialty and what you're doing is really the most important thing. That's what law firms care about. And then when you get a few years of experience doing the specialty, then that's really almost the only thing that the law firms are concerned about at that point is what you're doing. And your ability to be in one practice area to specialize will help you in terms of being able to move to a better or larger firm, depending on what you like to do. Okay, so I'll just take a quick break here for 1 minute. And then when I come back, I'll answer some questions. I'm not going to do a ton of questions today. And then we'll end a little early. I know we had last week, I think it was like a 3+ hour webinar. So this will be a little shorter today. And then I'll be back in a minute. Skills in other areas. So people that don't always do the best academically, a lot of times they'll go into these things where they're working for individuals because there's a lot more, they can go a lot farther. And it's funny, like some of the best personal injury attorneys, the most successful, they make more money than any company facing attorneys were like, oh, I had the best, I was the, worst student in my law school or whatever. And so there's nothing wrong with not being strong academically. But what I would say, and the big mistake that a lot of people make is, and this is a very important point, and I hope you walk away understanding this, people that don't have the intellectual ability to do the kind of work that big firms do, which just means company-facing type of work, shouldn't be doing that. And again, I'm not trying to be mean here, but trying to be in a big firm when you don't necessarily have the academic, you don't have the academic ability to do it, and they're never going to hire you, is really dumb, because you should be putting your effort into something where you're representing individuals and where your motivation and to desire to get ahead and stuff means a lot. If you do this, regardless, you could become rich and famous if you want to represent individuals. But if you do this, you try to do this, and if you don't have the intellectual ability, have the skills or have the smarts, and I don't mean that in a negative way, you'll do things like you'll end up a contract attorney, which again, nothing wrong with that, but you'll end up a contract attorney because these law firms are never going to be interested in you if you don't have the intellectual ability and you didn't do well in law school. You're not doing well in law school if you don't have the academic ability to, if it's not something that clicks for you, which is okay. You can do individual facing work. But this is a mistake so many people make, is they try to go into the wrong practice area or they try to represent companies when they don't have the academic ability, when really what they should be doing is representing individuals. Another one is like insurance defense. And there's so many things that people do that it's just not smart when they really could do very well if they were putting themselves, if they were going into the correct practice area. So there's nothing wrong with not doing well academically. You just need to go into the right practice area where you're going to be welcome and where you can advance. And the biggest mistake people try to do is they try to go someplace where they don't have the ability. So for myself, I do not like science. I just never have. So me trying to be a patent prosecution attorney would be insane. I would do it, but I would never be as smart or as gifted as people that are good at it. I could never work in a good patent prosecution firm. But if I tried to do that with commercial litigation, I could get a good job doing commercial litigation, but not past patent prosecution. No, I would be insane. That would be a horrible use of my time. So would corporate. So you just have to go into the right practice area with your academic skill. That's the biggest thing to understand. It doesn't matter how well you do academically. There's always a place for you, but you have to go into the right kind of firm. And just because a large law firm is not interested in you, it's not really something to worry too much about. So that was a great question. It's the next one. What weight do law firms typically give to work experience and practical skills when evaluating lateral candidates? Okay, so when the law firm's looking at lateral candidates, I did bring this up in the presentation, but I want to make sure that I go into a little bit more detail about this. So what happens when a law firm's looking at a lateral candidate? The only thing, so they care about two things. They care about the quality of firm that you're coming from, and they care about your practice area. And then they care that that's pretty much it. And then they care about your grades, but not that much. So let's talk about the quality of firms. So I've developed, and it doesn't make me special, but I've developed a way of ranking firms and candidates, which is basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what that means is one means consumer facing, meaning doing work for people, working consumer facing. This means consumer, maybe small business, maybe a little bit of small business. Business, this means primarily business, primarily small to mid-sized business. Companies. This means mid-sized to huge companies. And this just means huge companies, rarefied, top one, rarefied, top 1% of attorneys. So, you don't need to understand a lot about this, but that's pretty much it. So law firms care about the quality of a law firm you're coming from. A 4 firm would be, I don't know, Denton's. Okay, so Denton's is a good firm. So you could work at Denton's if you come from a 3 firm, or these are typically AmLaw 100, AmLaw 100 to 200, 200, and then these are good regional firms. You get the idea. Firms plus larger firms. So these are just all these types of firms are all over the country. Different types of firms. So if you're doing consumer-facing work, it's going to be very difficult to move to a 4 firm. So you can move from a 2 to a 3. Here you can move from a 1 to 2. You can move from a 3 to a 4. And here you can move pretty much 4 to 4. But sometimes 5, but very rarely. So this is how things work. So if you want to work at a better firm than you're currently at, so say you got a job at some regional firm that's not an AmLaw 100 law firm or mid-sized firm, law firms will evaluate you based on the quality of firm you're coming from. So I don't really know how much else to say about that, but this is what the law firms are most concerned about. So if you're at another huge firm and you want to move to another huge firm, like a 4 firm to a 4 firm, then it's not really going to be that difficult. You could also move from a 4 to a 3 and so forth. And then the next thing they care about is your practice area. Is that in demand? Is this in demand or not? So that's all. So is your practice area in demand or not? And what is your practice area? It's dependent on if no demand, you may need to go to a lower ranked firm. So you may need to go from 4 to 3. That makes sense. If there is demand, then can go from a 3 to a 4, et cetera. 4, and then if I don't know, but you get the idea. So that they're concerned about your practice area, and then they're concerned about that, and then after that, your grades. But the grades are much less important than the quality of firm you're at, because at this point, the idea is that you've gotten some training, you know what you're doing, and all these things are really going to be much more important than anything else in terms of what's going on. So your practice area, your grades. And then also it would be your geographic location. So your geographic location is also going to be very important. Is there demand in your location? So all this stuff, there demand. demand in your location. And that's pretty much it. Is there demand in your location? You have to look at the geographic location and then the practice area and then your grades. So really, this is enough. These things are all the stuff. I would say this is 60. This is how does it break down from? This is probably 60, 70%, 60, 50%. This is, I don't know, 40%, 30%, well, 50, I don't know what it would be, but you would say, what do they look at when they're hiring? And I would say this would be 30, 30, 30, I don't know, 40, 40, 40, 30, 30, I don't know, 30, and then maybe 30. I'm just working on this out for you guys, but 30%, then maybe this geographic would be 20. And this would be 10 or something. So you can see that it's really much less important, because once you get into a firm that's ranked a 4 or 3 or whatever, and you get this experience, the presumption is that you really know all this stuff. And so paying attention to your grades is just stupid. They're more concerned about whatever training you got in your practice area and so forth. Okay, this is something, I don't know why someone asked about this, but I'll answer it. Give me a second. How do law school grades influence career progression for senior associates? I think that's right. No, great. At this point, again, it's more the quality of the firm, the practice area, geographic location, and grades. As a senior associate, the most important thing is your experience. And then I would say experience would be 1. And then the next one would be your business generation potential. Then it would be your practice area. And then would be 2. And then your business generation potential. Would be 3. All right, let's see what else here. I often find myself questioning if my struggles with law school grades are a sign that I'm not cut off for the legal profession. Okay, so again, I think I answered this earlier, but if you don't have good law school grades, it doesn't mean you're not cut off for the legal profession. It doesn't mean you're not cut off for the legal profession. Grades determine the type of client. Let's see. The type of client and practice area. It should be involved with. That's it. So they just basically determine the type of client and practice area you should be involved in. So if you have bad grades, then you shouldn't be in a practice area where there's a lot of smart people trying to represent the same companies. That's pretty much it. Meaning, if you don't have a lot of aptitude for the practice of law or different types of work, and that doesn't mean you're not going to be a great attorney. That just means you need to means you need bad grades. Typically mean grades just mean you need to practice. You need to find a practice area where you can thrive. And what does that mean? It just means a lot of times, some of the worst students in the world were personal injury attorneys, but then they have so much ability to get things done and they do well. So it's just, you have to be in the right practice area, and you have to know, and you have to be in a practice area where your skills are going to do well. And typically, like I said above here, if you don't have the best grades, and you don't have, then you shouldn't be trying to compete with people that have the most aptitude for getting these sorts of grades all the time. You should try to do more consumer-facing practice areas where your skills with clients and persuading people and are going to have more of be more kind of front and center. My point to you is just that if you don't feel like you have the perfect skills and grades, it doesn't mean there's not a place for you practicing law. It just means you have to try to stay away from competing with the sorts of people that do. Now, I want to make one other point to you that's very important, and this is something that I think is very crucial to understand. Just because you don't have good grades doesn't mean that you're not going to become a great attorney. Sometimes not great grades in law school don't mean that you're not going to eventually learn things. Sometimes developing aptitude at something takes longer than for some people than others. And there's a lot of very well-known attorneys in huge firms that are partners that didn't get good grades and that are competing in very hard practice areas with a lot of smart people. And those attorneys ended up having very good careers because they learned and just kept fighting and getting better. I know of people that are partners in major law firms that passed took several times and passed the bar exam or were fired from their first jobs. And, so a lot of it is about persistence and about staying with it and not giving up, because what happens is a lot of people out there end up giving up. And so if you give up, then it's really the number one thing. My point is, though, is if you don't have a huge aptitude for this and you really do try, you don't see anything good happening, you're in the wrong practice area, you're trying to compete for the wrong types of jobs. You need to figure out where you're going to wind up. Okay, as an attorney with less than stellar law school grades, I often worry about my job. Can you share insight how legal recruiters can help? Okay, so it's interesting in terms of what we do as legal recruiters. A lot of people believe that they need to try to work at the very largest firms or the best firms, but you don't. Legal recruiters, good ones, most of the legal recruiters out there will only help, at least for permanent positions, people that are trying to get into the largest firms and the best practice areas at the right time. But legal recruiters, good ones, can help anyone. It doesn't matter. They can help family law attorneys, they can help insurance defense attorneys, because their law firms will hire all these people. And so it doesn't matter. Law school grades are only important at the most competitive law firms representing the largest company. The biggest law firms representing the largest companies are pretty much where grades matter. So if you don't have that, then that's fine. You don't have, this is only a small portion of the legal work out there. So if you don't have that, there's really no point in worrying about it. It's just, you just have to work at other types of firms. But again, even if you don't have the best grades, it's more important. I mean, your practice area is more important. Practice area is more important and your commitment and the type of firm you're coming from than any of this stuff. So this is what matters. It's the practice area and the type of firm you're coming from. The other stuff is much less important. Let's see. Okay, so there's a lot of the same questions. I'll keep answering them. I don't have one more time, but I know I'm not going to get to a lot of these questions. Working diligently as a junior associate, you're going to take on more responsibilities, moving to leadership. Okay, so again, your grades don't matter. It's grades, your practice area, and the caliber firm. Are most important. That's it. That's all that matters. The grades are much less important. So I'll try to emphasize this in a different way. So say there's 1,000 attorneys. Say let's just, take a different, Minneapolis or something. So Minneapolis, every year there's maybe, 250 junior associates hired, or first year attorneys hired. This is I don't know what the number is, attorneys hired. The number is probably closer to 500, but maybe let's say 400. 400 first year hired in Minneapolis proper every year. So year one, you might have, this is just an example, you might have 50 corporate attorneys, 100 commercial litigators, 150 commercial litigators, these are just examples, 150 real estate. And let's just say at three ranked firms. Anyway, I'm not going to rank firms. Okay, by year 4, same class year, say class year 2030, just an example. So year one, okay, so then by 2034, you're going to have the same class year of the 2030 class year. So you're going to have, still practicing, you might have 20 corporate. Yeah. I don't know, 20 commercial litigators. It's just people with firms. The point is that what happens over time is the number of people you're competing with for the same jobs gets less and less. And so because of that, the law firms can no longer afford to be selective about your grades. They don't care. They just need people. They need the few people that are still doing the work, because all these people that start are just dropping out and doing other things and moving out of. I mean, I don't know, but you get the idea. So because there's fewer people, the law firms really can't worry as much about your grades. They don't care. Like they need people that are still practicing, and that's all they can. That's the only thing that they have to go on at that point. So the longer you stick with it, the less your grades are going to matter. And the more you're in a certain practice area where there's not a lot of other people, the better off you're going to be. So all that stuff becomes much more important. Okay, let me just see. This is my final question. And then I know there's some still ones pending, but I'm trying to get out of here today about really. Okay, so I noticed that some firms and employers solely focus on law school grades. Okay, the only firms that solely focus on law school grades there's a couple of calibers of them. So one is going to be, the firms that focus fully on law school grades is going to be, they're going to be the most prestigious firms. And the other is going to be firms hiring law students. Other than that, the stuff about law school grades is really the most important thing is always going to be your practice area. And you say work at dedication of relevant experience. Yes, those are the most important things. So here's the idea. So when people, and this is the final thing I'm going to talk about, but when people get out of law, when people are in law, when people get their first jobs, they're a clean slate. So grades matter. Grades matter at that point. Grades matter. But then what happens after their first jobs? Then people start doing stuff like stuff happens. So stuff starts happening. People get fired, laid off. They move firms. They switch practice areas. They switch practice settings. Which is, they'll do stuff like go in house, government, all this stuff happens. So all this stuff starts happening. And I don't know there's a bunch of stuff that starts happening. And cities, all these things start happening. Then people start looking at all this stuff. They're like, what the hell's going on with this person? So all these reasons start happening to exclude you. And there's just been, when you start looking at someone's resume several years out, like people are focusing more on all this stuff than their grade. They're looking, does this person look like they're going to stick around? Does this look like a permanent long-term hire? Like all these things start mattering a lot, and they start mattering more than anything. And so people the firms start focusing on all this stuff. And when they focus on this stuff, they start losing track. The grades become much less important. So the big thing, I guess the big takeaway today is it's more important to worry about your practice area and the quality firm we're coming from as a lateral attorney are more important. And then in your grades, the type of firm you go to is really what's going to matter the most, is not necessarily your grades, where you're coming from, or your grades when you're coming out of law school. It's going to matter your practice, the practice area you're in, and your commitment to that practice area is really the most important thing. Then the final thing is, if you don't get good grades, you just have to choose what type of firm you're going to work in or what practice area. So if you come out of law school and you can't get a job with these huge law firms, you shouldn't worry about that. You should just go to a practice area and get training in something where you could set up your own practice, or where you could do something where you could work and get training in a practice area. You could end up being financially very well off, which could be all these sorts of things. I see there's still several questions, and I apologize for not getting to them. I'm trying to actually get out of town today, but I definitely appreciate all the questions and everyone showing up for this webinar. I hope this has been helpful about grades. And how little they matter in the long run. And I will look forward to talking to everyone next week. So thank you for being here today. And I will be back next week. If I didn't get your question today, I will definitely make sure I do next week. Thank you.